good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this presentation. And thank you for a very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Pantelis Koutroupis. I lead a group on technological and economic change here at the Martin School. And it's a great pleasure this afternoon to have with us Dr. Bledi Taska, who will help us think about the topic about remote work across firms, across space, and across jobs, which are very much the topics that relate very much to the research that we do here at the Martin School. And I hope that Bledi will help us and guide us through all these interesting questions. It is a global phenomenon. It is becoming very pervasive these days. So we look forward to the explanations and the data that Bledi will give us. I'm also delighted that we have people both joining us here and online. Thank you very much for joining, and also keep an eye on the events that the Oxford Martin School has in the coming weeks. The structure of this event is that Bledi will give us his insights and presentation of his research, and then there's going to be a Q&A session where I hope everyone will get his chance and her chance to ask questions about this research. A little bit of background. Bledi Taska is the Executive Vice President at Lightcast and Chief Economist, and he is a labor economist who leads a group of economists and data scientists, and they look into labor market data, real-time labor market data. They look into interesting questions around skills mismatch, labor shortages, effects of automation, reskilling of workers, and other areas. His work has appeared in many popular media outlets, as well as top economics journals. And above and beyond all, I think Bledi is a very generous, very curious, very intelligent person, and we're delighted to have him here. And the way he thinks about these complex issues, combining this detailed data, is what we really appreciate. So, armed with all this impressive data about the labor markets, Bledi will talk today about remote work. And over to you, Bledi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mandeli, and thank you everyone for the invitation and for being great hosts. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm, as Mandeli said, I'm the chief economist at Lightcast, which is a real-time labor market analytics firm, but I'm also a labor economist by training, which at some point went to the dark side, and I'm doing research for fun. So today I'm going to talk about something that all of us are been aware of for the past couple of years, which is remote work, and so I'll show you some of the trends and what the data says about it, especially sort of from the demand side and the supply side. But most importantly, I want to motivate a discussion around two topics that are very specific and very central to what Dr. Martin does, which is the future of work and future development. And you'll see that essentially remote work can potentially be very essential about those two, and it can inform us essentially in terms of a discussion that we can have. Okay, so today this is going to be what I'm going to present in is part of two strands of work. One more a bit academic one, done with Stephen Hansen, Stephen Davis, Peter Lambert, Nick Bloom, and Rafaela Sadoun, where we use online postings to understand the demand and trends across the globe. And there's also a more recent one that we're doing with Revelio Labs. It's a bit more of a policy work, which essentially we look at the supply side. But my goal here today is to be able to connect these two together and sort of like what are the potential implications about future of work and future of development. So just a brief summary in a more academic style. What are some of the things that we learn? Well, unsurprisingly, we did learn that remote work has become established part of the hiring strategy. We've seen it increase by 3x in US and actually by way more in UK. And also, if you have any insights as to why UK is seeing this, I'd love to talk to you later. But there's also some surprising things that we do learn. And one of them is that the share of remote workers that we estimate is very different, essentially, than others that have been estimated in the literature. So, for example, if you go in US or even in Germany, there's around 25% of people actually working remotely, and or 30 to 35, depending on the country, right? But what we find is a little bit different, and that is because a posting is a promise of the employer to essentially hire you for the next couple of years, right? So if I'm hiring you, and if I tell you you're going to work remotely, I can't take you back, right? But if I tell you, well, you can go and, today you can work remote, I can say in 3 months you can come back. So that there's this, version commitment that we're seeing in the posting data that actually brings to, lower estimates, right? And obviously, we find that, remote work varies greatly across occupation, industries, and cities. And again, unsurprisingly, you find that it's correlated with computer use, education and learnings. But I think some of the interesting patterns do come from when we're seeing some of the results for the cities. And again, here is the cities that are a little bit more expensive that we're seeing, immense growth in remote work. And finally, this growth in sort of like in remote work originally starts, from the local level, right? And so like either you can think in US or in UK, first, employers are looking for opportunities outside because A, they are losing people, but also there's a lot of cheap talent essentially to look for. So if I'm an employer in UK, I'm starting looking in other places essentially. But think a bit in terms of more globally, and what this is going to show is that there are now arbitrage opportunities in terms of wages that are happening first locally, but also in other places. So if I'm an employer in UK, now maybe I can hire a software developer, somewhere in southern Italy, and then in a couple of years, or even now, as I will show some of the data, maybe hire somebody in Africa. And again, so from a global perspective, now, COVID and remote work showed us that there is actually remote work can be done, which was a little bit of a taboo, and there are a lot of talent opportunities out there. And this is, I'll try to show that it is very different than what essentially we've been doing for outsourcing, which has been around for 20, 30 years. Okay, so why are we doing this? Well, the first motivation was because it's confusing, right? If you go to the media today and you see essentially what some of the information, you get confused. Some of the media are saying that employers want people to go back, and then you hear, well, people don't want to go back, and then there's discussion between hybrid and there's discussion between remote. So what is really happening, right? And there's a lot of surveys, but most of them have a significant lag, right? Either in US or in other places. It's not easy to understand almost in real time. And this is where the data helps. Because we've developed also a sort of a dashboard that everybody can go and access online. It's called Working From Home Map. And you can see, at least for those countries, every month we update the data, and you can see what happens to remote work. And so first goal for us is to measure trends in remote work in almost real time and sort of solve this inefficiency that might exist with survey data. Okay, how do we do that? So first on the demand side, which is the most established for the moment, we use online job vacancies data from Lightcast, where essentially we go and aggregate from many, many sources to be able to make sure that this is capturing, it's a good proxy for labor demand, more than 50,000 sources overall. We deduplicate the data and then we structure it. And for this project, we use data for US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And now we're working with expanding this in continental Europe. There are some language challenges there because, again, this is a machine learning model that has to be run and trained on text data. But there are some, we can discuss more, some ways actually to get around it. And the sample period, is 14 to 23. And for each online job vacancy, we have both the unstructured text and structured covariates. We use the unstructured text to understand if this is a remote job or not. I'm going to show you how. And then we use these different variables to understand how the remote work varies across occupation, across employer and location. Sample sizes differ significantly by region. Also, they are correlated with population. But in US, for example, to give you an idea, we have around 40 million observations per year. Very large sample, and also to give some context that the employed population in the US is 150 million. So you get approximately one job posting, one position per 3 people working by country. And there's also a very large sample of employers, 3.5 million US, and then as you go, the sample gets reduced. Now, it would be a missed opportunity to present this in UK and not to talk about WAM, but essentially this is a machine learning algorithm, is what we call work from home algorithmic measure. Right? So this is, in a way to make it simpler, one of these large language models. It's called Dilbert. It's a cheaper version of BERT, and it runs more efficiently. But what we do is that we get humans to go and check 30,000 postings and say, is this a remote job or not, right? And so we create this training set by having human classification for 30,000 postings, and then we use that to train a model to be able to understand for the rest of millions and millions of observation if this is, it would be extremely, again, complicated and costly if we were to humanly classify all those 200 and something million observations by hand. So the model is, delivers more almost near human performance, and actually I think what we're going to show is that we're not the first to try this on online job postings, but you'll see that there's some nuances that this model essentially gets a lot better than more string matches or rule-based, what we call models. And so these are some examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but again, in the left-hand side, you have these false positives, which you think it is work from home, but if you read it very carefully, it is not. And then on the right hand, you have false negatives. But some of these could be potentially alleviated by some more sophisticated rules. So for example, the first two say, you will work from home care facility, right? So this is not a work from home, this is working at a home care facility. But if you're only looking for like a specific string, right, you'll not be able to get it. The second, the same, work remotely, but it has a no. So if you were to use some neighborhood rules or negation rules, you could potentially alleviate some of this. But the other two are more complicated, right? It says previous experience working in remote locations. This is very hard to get with rule-based. Same, the other one may respond to managerial or home office requests, right? Same idea if you're working from a home office. So there's a lot of those examples, but again, and there's a lot of analysis within the paper. If you're interested, you can go and see it. But the idea is that it's not easy in many cases to be able just from specific keywords to understand if this is a remote work or not position. And then the idea is that, again, the dictionary view only looks at very specific words, but the LLM actually looks at the whole context and actually puts weights on the remote work, but it also puts weights on the other. Okay, now to the interesting stuff. Let me show you how results look like and what we learned from this. So unsurprisingly, we did see that remote work increased significantly post-COVID, but I personally did learn something even just by looking at this specific graph. First of all, what I found surprising is that remote work was not zero pre-COVID. There was actually some good percentage of jobs that were being done remotely, and in US it was around 4%, and in UK it was lingering around 3%. So that was kind of an interesting thing because, again, there are people that have been working on this for a long time and they've been discussing it, but the idea is that COVID changed everything, and it did. And then actually the other fact that UK is significantly higher than the rest was also an interesting example. And then the fact that, again, we've been hearing that remote work is decreasing significantly, we're going back to the office. This also includes the past 2-3 months of 23, the first 2 months of 23, and we do see a little bit of a drop, but we're not seeing this dramatical drop that you hear in the media. It seems like we're again, there might be some, I still think we're not in equilibrium, but again, we're not all the way back. One thing to explain about this graph is that this graph, in simple ways, is actually taking into account the composition of demand. So it is controlling for occupation distribution, because occupations are very different in this country. So this is imposing the same distribution of occupations, making sure that this is apples to apples, and only the variation is coming from the within occupation variation, not across occupation. Similarly, when you look at occupations, you find some interesting stuff and you find some more interesting stuff. I think the interesting, but not as surprising, is that we're seeing the concentration and the growth happening a lot in tech jobs. But there are also other type of occupations that potentially maybe we're not there, like legal or architecture and engineering or art design and entertainment, that seem to appear and actually have significant growth. These were not like your traditional occupations, essentially, that you've seen before. So this graph is trying to do too much. It has a lot of information in a way. I think the main point that it's trying to show here is that if you draw an the line, the majority of the occupation are above that, and essentially shows that after 19, the majority of them actually grew. Some other interesting thing is that it also tried to compare with another known paper, which is the Dingle and Newman, and you can see in their cases some of the occupations essentially that they classified as non-teleworkable, which is like travel agents or advertising sales agents. They are actually some of the most teleworkable when you see the data. I think this, for me, starts to bring some of, personally, the most interesting insights is that when you look at cities and regions that are growing the most, right, essentially these are the most kind of expensive cities. And there's a lot of things that are playing here. I mean, obviously the first one is the composition, again, of the occupations and demand. In a lot of the cities, you have more, remotable occupations than in other places, as we'll see. But that's not the only thing that is happening, right? These are also more expensive, so they are, seeing brain drain during period of COVID. And they're also, because they're expensive, they can also find more opportunities. Like, again, from a personal experience, when I'm in Boston, for me, being able to look in other regions made it a lot easier, not cheaper, to be able to find, talent that potentially just if I would focus only specifically in the region. And here you can see a little bit more clearly, because again, this is doing for US, but it's doing all of the regions, all of the states. You can see here that the composition essentially of demand, is playing a role. And so, like, the ones that are growing the most are ones that essentially are both the most expensive, but also ones that have more remotable jobs. But then on the other hand, the ones that did not have as much and are not growing as much are ones that, where the industries are such that these are not so much of remotable jobs in there. And similar graph here. And finally, from the demand side, again, there's a lot of here that is, firm specific, and is driven, by firm idiosyncrasies, and we're still looking into this, and so like, what is it driving? And I think, in this case, we're conditioning on the same occupation group and the same industries, and we see that there are significant differences. And I think when Carl first posted this, he called this the Tesla effect or the Elon effect. And you can see this, essentially, that you can see SpaceX and Tesla being some of the lowest, essentially in remote jobs, both in terms of levels and actually they didn't grow at all, right? Again, there is also potentially some noise in our data as well, but you can see that there's some variation happening. Okay. Now, this is what we're learning from the demand side. And again, there's a website you can all go and play around. The data gets updated every month. We're trying to, again, expand this in Europe first. And then next, hopefully, we're going to try to expand this globally as well in Latin America and in other places as well. But recently, we also tried to look also the supply side. What happens to people? Again, this is what companies say they want, but we don't always know if this is happening, at what level is this happening, right? So for this case, we used online social profiles from Revelio Labs, where we have more than 500 million profiles globally and more than 120 million profiles in the US. Remember, these are profiles that exist online, so we have the latest work history of the latest job of an individual, but this is a panel document, so we can see for at least when they put in it there for all of the history of their work and all of their education history, but also the location of where they've been in previous jobs and also where they are currently. And we're using this to define remote, which in this case is a fairly lower bound in the sense that these are fully remote individuals. Like we are not able to identify for this at least part of the project if you are living in Oxford and then you come into the office 2-3 days a week, but then the rest you're working from home. But essentially, if you are, let's say, in US and you are, your office is in Boston and you are living in New York, then we are able to call that individual remote in this case. And we're also, if you are living in Latin America and you're working with somebody either in Europe or in US, we're able to call that person remote. Again, there's a lot of work to get the levels correct, depending on the question that you want to ask. But mostly the thing that we are focusing here is sort of the trends and what we are seeing and how that might be important sort of from policy implications. Right, so what are we seeing? Again, this is just the first level in terms of understanding. When you look at US and different states and where the individual are, you see almost sort of a doubling even from 2020. And again, in 2020, not a lot of this fully remote had happened, so I think it's fine to use that as a benchmark because people have not still started, leaving their places, but that was sort of the benchmark. And then when you look in 23, you actually see that, people are, compared at least the growth in terms of people working in different locations for the company is actually increasing. And similar, picture comes from if you look at India or other places. Now, what we're interested in this case is to understand, okay, but what does this mean for employers? We saw this from a personal also experience that, again, this first happened within regions, within United States. Like there was this wage arbitrage opportunity appearing. Like, companies in San Francisco realized that, well, I can look for people in cheaper places. Companies in London probably did the same. Companies in Munich probably did the same, right? And, I was in Munich today, and they said, yes, we were actually working with people in Vienna and other places. And so, like, this is happening. It's not just, something that, potentially of interest. But we're seeing some specific pairs appearing in the data, right? So we're seeing North America with Central America and the Caribbean, or we're seeing Southern Europe with Sub-Saharan Africa showing up in terms of growth of what has happened in the past couple of years. So that tells us that there is something here is happening in the past couple of years that is related with companies being able to, to find talent that is potentially cheaper in some of those places. And when we look at the cost differences, right, and then we're going to correlate the two, this is showing essentially sort of like the discount that a company can take by looking for workers somewhere else. So if I'm in North America and I look, again, this is average across all occupations, but if I'm in North America and I'm looking in South America, I get almost an 80% discount in terms of the workers that I would potentially be able to get. Now, the discount is not the only thing, right? That there's also a lot of other things at play that create sort of this premium. The first is the time zone, right? So the time zone matters a lot because either you're in the same time zone or you have like a couple of hours difference. That is fairly doable, and so especially in a sort of more asynchronous way that we are working now. But if you're somewhere where you have 12 hours difference, that makes it a lot harder, right? And so that partially where you're going to see some of these pairs is going to be because of similar time zone. And US and South America have a very similar time zone. The other is the language, right? In places, not only talent matters, but if the talent also has the language and is able to essentially not have those barriers, like for example, Chile, a lot of people there speak English very well, that makes it also a lot more attractive. So time zone, but then finally sort of the infrastructure and how easy or difficult it is also for the companies. And I think this is something very important also from a policy perspective for Europe. Now, I don't know how things might have changed, but last year where I was here in summer, there was a lot of discussion that people were not able to work and live essentially in different countries. So if I'm working for the company in UK, it was kind of difficult at least to work for more than some specific time to live in Germany or in other places, right? Because there are a lot of tax considerations. Now, there might be some validity to why companies might be doing this or location might be doing this, but if at the end of the day, what will happen is that for people, it is easier to work with a company in US versus in Europe, that might imply a very significant brain drain for Europe in the years to come, right? Because I cannot imagine why somebody would not want to go and live in Greece, work somewhere with US, get best of the two worlds where I get the weather and I get the salary, right? And if Europe does not allow this sort of digital mobility within, there are going to be significant problems in terms of digital brain drain. So when we correlate these two, we find that there is some correlation. The axis might not be the most. We might have to do it in absolute terms, but the idea is that the more discount you get, essentially, which has to be an absolute, the more we see the growth happening in sort of these region pairs. So between North America and Central America, where we're seeing or Southern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing some of the highest discounts. That's where we're seeing also a lot of growth. Okay, so essentially, this is a little bit of a, waving hands, but the idea is that it is to be, it's to motivate for future research. But the thing is that we personally believe that this time is different, right? And again, we've been doing outsourcing for 20, 30 years, so this is not the first time that doing remote work, we reinvented remote work. Remote work has been there, but outsourcing has focused on very entry-level jobs or very specific tasks of sort of, the tech jobs. Like, we would outsource very concrete, things to people, and it's like you do A, B, C, and D, and not only you do A, B, C, and D, but you do A, and if A, then B, and C, and so like very, very specific tasks. And what we're seeing, at least right now, is that this time is different. Like, we've seen an expansion of the remote work that goes beyond this entry level or this basic sort of, tasks that maybe outsourcing, was doing. Right, so again, this is a little bit of a same data, but different, axis. But if you just look at the occupations with the highest share of remote, it's the web ones and the tech ones. But if you look at the ones that are growing the most, those are not the tech ones. Right? So marketing, for example, or engineering or manufacturing have also seen a lot of growth. And again, this is not the outsourcing story. This is within US, but still we're seeing a lot of this growth happening in areas that essentially are not tech. And the tech, for example, here is sixth. And the other thing is that when we look at jobs that are remote and non-remote, and we compare in terms of skills how similar they are, we find that they're actually fairly similar. There are some differences, especially sort of like communication skills and leadership skills that are needed for the remote work to be effective. But when you look at the technical skill, they are fairly. So here we're doing similarity index, so like just trying to see like how skills are similar between the two jobs, and we find that they're fairly similar. So when employers are looking for a remote job versus a non-remote job, they are looking for fairly the same person. These are not different individuals that they are looking for, at least in the past couple of years. Right? And finally, again, when we're looking at some type of specialization, right, we're seeing that there are specific opportunities in different areas of the world where, for employers becomes more, more prominent to be able to find. So, for example, if you're looking for a graphic designer, Bangladesh is it's an obvious place that potentially might be able to show. So, essentially, again, some of these results are trying to motivate the fact that this time is kind of different, and it might have implications for for both employers and essentially for employees, but also most importantly for the future of cities. So let me give you a couple of ideas of what I think those might be. So first of all, there are some conclusions for the future of work, and those are both from the employer side but also from the employee side. Right? So for the employer, again, now we've discovered that remote work is effective, although there's still debates if how much or not is that, and there's a lot of saying that we cannot do it, but essentially employers are realizing that this is giving them an advantage. The idea that you can find the best talent, irrespective of the borders, is very strong. And we're thinking in today's terms, right? We're saying, well, but you're here in JP Morgan or other places, or Tesla saying that people have to come back. And I think I have two ideas about that. First, I don't think all jobs can be done remotely, but we're also thinking in sort of short terms. Now, think about 5 to 10 years from now, and ignore a lot of the sunk costs that exist, because a lot of the discussion right now is because essentially, we have invested a lot of money in places and in offices, and those leases, are going on for 10 years. But what happens when new startups and new companies are coming around that they want to be the most cost-effective? Will they invest in an office? Will they look for, talent everywhere they can, irrespectively? My bet it is that they will, right? And so, in a way, this idea that, going and finding the people where they are and not being constrained by a border or by office, I think it's too powerful for the market to ignore in the long run. I think there's going to be pushback in the short run, but I don't think we'll be able to ignore it for a time. And then, how do you compete with that startup if they have the cheaper talent and they are not having the cost of the office, right? I think you have to adjust, right? So I think there are significant implications for employers, not in the immediate short run, but definitely in the longer run. And on the other hand, this is also a market force because employees have realized that they, at least some of them, depending also on the age and also on the errands that they have to run, that having the flexibility is a good thing. But if one of the employers is offering this, for the other one, even if they don't want to, they need to take this into consideration because now there's market competition, right? And so it becomes a significant force, and it becomes an amenity that a lot of employers are offering. And you as an employer might or might not have the choice, because if you decide to not hear the market, then you are going to be losing, talent. So the point I'm trying to make is that in the next couple of years, I don't think this is done, and we are going to see a lot of sort of equilibrium effects happening in the near future that are going to be pushed by what the market essentially dictates. But the things that excite me even more is what this means for regions, right? And I think there's two implications here. There's a local and there's the sort of the international implication. Locally or semi-locally, we've seen a lot of workforce development, policies, right, happening before. And regions that wanted to essentially develop, they had this regional policy where they had to attract a company to come there. They would provide incentives for the company. Lots of them, a lot of times, and a lot of times would actually be fairly ineffective, depending, on the investment of the firm or not. But now this decouples that. Now, for me to be, to develop and to have a lot of people and to be able to capture this, it doesn't mean that I actually need the company. I need the people. And instead of providing those incentives to the company, I could provide those incentives to individuals. And this is happening somehow, either with the nomad visas or either specific subsidies that regions are doing across the world for people to come. It's still an experiment, but as an idea, it's powerful. But again, because it gives a new tool to your workforce economic development agents to be able to work that does not include essentially does not involve the company itself. But it also cuts both ways. Like for regions that are expensive and few amenities, see, for example, San Francisco, maybe, it gives less incentive for people to be there. If now, I don't have to be here because I don't need to work, I don't need to be here to work with a company, and I can be in another place, and I don't have any amenity for it, it's not a nice place to live, then there's no reason for me to stay there anymore. So it does create this sort of, imbalance in terms of like what will happen in the next few years for regions. And this is the part where I'd love to hear your thoughts, because it's a bit more far-fetched, but there are also important implications for immigration, right? And there are important implications for immigration because we could lead to some type of what I will call digital immigration. But most importantly, it gives the incentives to region to invest even more in the education and reskilling and upskilling of their individuals, right? Now, if somebody from any developing country has the opportunity to potentially work with a company in the developed world, they don't need to leave physically. But think about it before, right? Say you're to get somebody from a developing country, say, you have the opportunity to go to US or to London. Then all you have to do is to study hard and to be the best software developer in the world. Like, do you think they would take it? Like, I'm sure, I bet that they would. But that was an impossibility, right? Because it depended a lot on other things. It depended a lot on getting the visa and all of those things. But now that is, again, it's not 0-1, it's not that it disappeared, but the barriers became significantly lower. That person does now have some opportunity to be able to work potentially with a company in the developed world. And that also creates incentive both at the individual level, but also for regions themselves to be able to educate and train big masses of their population. And I'm very excited about that in some ways because, again, it might mean that we might see some type of convergence, a digital convergence potentially across all of these regions that remote work might bring. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to open it for discussion. Well, Okay, we'll start from you here.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Peter, they can't hear you online.
Okay. Yes, Bledi, thank you very much. Super interesting. I was triggered by the first graph that you showed, actually, where you see that the percentage of jobs or vacancies in the US that you could do remotely was higher than the ones in the UK. And then suddenly, after COVID, UK just shoots higher than the US, right?
Yes.
You have any explanation for this particular pattern?
I do
Because
not.
the order sort of seems to be the same, except these two countries.
I do not. That is actually something that I would also like to understand better. And if somebody has any intuition as to why that might happen, I would like to know as well. But I do not.
My thought could be, so I was also thinking about it, that a lot of people in the UK suddenly managed to find a place in the US to work?
I don't know. I mean, I think this. I mean, if I had to do, I can take wild guesses, and this might be also, an interesting research question. But potentially, Brexit might have played a role. Again, I think a big part of why remote work, survived and will survive was because of labor shortages. Right? And labor shortages do play an important role to, the bargaining power that the employee has versus the employer. And UK has been, famously known for the past couple of years that it has significant labor shortages. US as well, but I think labor shortages here might have been even more severe because, again, you had two things happening at the same time, right? I think the one thing was the economy, and labor shortages were kind of similar everywhere, but that together with sort of with Brexit in the past couple of years might have created an additional UK effect. And so in that case, my guess would be that potential labor shortages created sort of this additional, bargaining power potentially for employees here as well.
I'm just going to jump in because there's a question online similar to that. It might even be exactly the same. Why does the UK have such a high percentage of remote work when other countries have a more scattered population?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the scattered population. I think that the main difference here is between, UK and US, and essentially, what that may mean. I mean, in terms of scattered, yes, US is larger, but to be honest, I don't have a great answer. Carl.
Just related to that very briefly, have you tried to drop London from UK and surrounding areas and see what's happened? Because I would suspect it's just because the UK happens to have one hub where a lot of people in professional services work, but that's super expensive, and a lot of people live outside London and commute.
It could be, yeah.
And if you drop like New York in the UK, US, it probably doesn't make a difference, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there could be definitely sort of a, if you look at the concentration of jobs between their hub and overall, I think that potentially is bringing, a big part of that. And so actually that, the comment about scatteredness, I actually, although counterintuitively, it probably works on the opposite, right? Because you have different hubs, but you also have a lot of other places that are bringing the average down, right? In UK, you have London and some of the other places, but London is a bigger part of the economy than potentially, San Francisco, New York, and the rest are. And so, like, what we know, and New York is definitely big, but California is the largest. But then you have Texas and Florida, right? Essentially, which are also some of the top three in US. And a lot of those might have jobs that are not being done remotely, and a lot of that is potentially bringing the economy down.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in. Sorry, Farshad, again. JW said maybe there has always been an overconcentration of job opportunities in London and South East, and that might be why the UK has...
Well, I guess this differences between UK was very interesting. I mean, I remember when you first also kind of talk about it on Twitter, is kind of this discussion kind of broke. Something about the UK is that is different from any other country. They have a very high share of gig economy and it's just increasing. So something that I wonder is if some of this gig basically workers that are self-employed actually transit to the remote work for other company because they could kind of like keep their flexibility. So basically from the self-employed to working remotely for other countries, other companies. And to kind of deviate a little bit from this discussion, I'm generally thinking about your thought about the kind of extent that remote work kind of could, expand the boundary that company could kind of hire workers based on the cultural differences.
Mm-hmm.
So if the kind of cultural differences between two country area, even cities, could kind of limit the let's say, outreach of the remote work towards some regions?
I mean, I can speculate, but it's a research question in the sense that I don't know. I mean, in the sense, like, I don't know how much culturally similar, India and US were all this time, but the, US outsourced a lot of very specific jobs to India for a very long time, probably not only US. So I think cultural difference definitely, are some barriers, but as with everything else, you kind of try to alleviate some of this potentially. And so there is a way, I mean, for remote work to work, it can't just be, it's not just the concept of I'm doing this online and that's it. Like there's a lot into this asynchronous, communication and working together that needs to be in place. And so, like, for example, the reason why it worked potentially in India, even with before, was because there were specific centers there and there were people there locally that would be managing, like, so the management aspect would not fully happen, from US. And similarly, for remote work to work, there's got, I mean, again, it will be also a little bit of an experiment going forward, because one of the reasons why it worked is because some of the things were already in place. A lot of the teams were in place. It would be interesting to see how this works when completely new teams are being created from scratch remotely. Right? When you already have when people already know the work, when the managers are already in place, it might be a little bit easier potentially, right, to hire people remotely, because they can train the people, they can communicate with the people, they can try to share that the company culture potentially. But if you're to hire everyone from scratch and not creating like a remote culture, even within I think that will definitely be challenging. Yes.
So in developing countries, what are the incentives for public authorities and private companies to pay the upfront costs of education and training if an increasing proportion of the people with education and training then work remotely for the developed countries and don't contribute directly to economic growth and development in the developing countries?
So that will depend on how they, the policy that they will have to be able to capture some of these benefits, right? And I think the idea here is it's not any different than remittances, right? If these people would leave and they would go to a developed country and they would send money back, right? There's this sort of incentive because, the country, the origin country is capturing some of these economic benefits. I think it's the same thing, as long as the country is able to capture in terms of taxes. So they might not be able to tax the company, but they are able to tax the revenue from the individuals, and there is significantly higher economic activity. I think there's significant incentives for them actually to keep the people there and be able to bring all of this revenue in the country. I think that's easier said than done, because again, with some discussion I had last year with policymakers from Latin America, they are already facing this issue. Like, they already had significant problems of tax evasion. And now there's we have both now brain drain and tax evasion, because a lot of people are working with companies in US, and we're not being able to capture any of this revenue in terms of taxes. So I think there are significant barriers to pass there, but if the country is able to capture that, I don't see it as any different than remittances coming to the country, but in these cases, people actually don't have to move.
Hi, sorry to go back to the graph.
Sure.
But I was thinking some ideas that they have already said, and maybe we are missing Brexit effect here, because we were living the pandemic joined with the Brexit effect, and many EU citizens that they are not UK nationals, or they have problems with residency, is a way of as well capturing these workers that they may leave otherwise.
Yes. No, I think Brexit definitely playing a role. I don't know the institutional aspect of that. For example, again, some of you might know better, but like even if that was possible to work remotely for a long time, so for example, if Brexit happened and people had to go back to their home country, could they, in theory, continue and working with, from a tax perspective? Because I know there are some tax issues and tax treaties, I think, but definitely Brexit is sort of the hidden candy in here.
On the development side of things, first of all, there's been a long, like more than a decade, where there's been a lot of outsourcing and platforms where you could find freelancers doing this
Yes.
work. So perhaps the direct effect after COVID might have been that these people turned into something more formal, where
Yes.
they work for those firms. But the second is that, I mean, traditionally we think about like the governments making decisions about reskilling, upskilling people, and how they should turn their universities into places where people get all the digital skills. But in today's world, all these things have changed, and also you can get those skills through other means. So essentially, if the demand in the market for this type of skills is high and needs to be adapted to specific places in the world, I think that we might not even need to go through the discussion about whether the local universities or the local authorities have to do something. If there is a demand, which what we mostly see is a demand from the labor side of things, I don't know how that would fit in this discussion.
No, I fully agree. I mean, but if I had to guess, I think both of it will happen. I mean, I think, yes, the fact that so much information is free and you can actually access it online, like somebody can go and get MIT classes by now. It's open, right? And in theory, any child from everywhere in the world can go and study at MIT, quote unquote. I think that's amazing. And so definitely it's very different than what was 20 years ago. So I think, yes, you are absolutely right that from an individual perspective, there's less barriers to learning, and a lot of that will happen at the individual level. But governments are also doing a lot of this. I mean, I think they have realized that. I mean, there's, at least personally, with almost every country that I've been in contact, there are discussions about upskilling and reskilling. And so, I think a lot are using, for example, Singapore as sort of the benchmark, which essentially has some very effective and active reskilling programs. But there's from countries to Latin America to Asia, everywhere they are talking about this. So it's not something that is like second, third in their mind. There are significant. And Europe has this 5-year skills, and it's the year of skills this year.
So we have Tematayo online has said that if the jobs aren't advertised as remote working, can they transition into remote working jobs? And does your data collect that information?
If they're advertising as remote or non-remote?
If they're not advertised as remote working, can they become a remote working job? And does your data capture that?
I mean, usually from my experience, that is not a possibility. I mean, what there might be is that there might be some noise in the data. So there are some companies where potentially they might have a sort of a full blank statement like Airbnb. And I think most of the time those are actually also transition periods. Airbnb for some times was saying that all of their jobs are remote, but they were not really advertised. Like if you go to their job posting, they're not advertised. But that was more of a transitory period. And then eventually they did add it to every job posting. So I think that's a measurement noise. But in real terms, for a non-remote job to actually become remote in the job posting, or overall as a phenomenon, I find that very difficult. I think what has happened from a personal experience is that, especially with workers that potentially might be experienced, there are individual discussions with managers, and if you see that for somebody, being remote is very important, and your decision is between losing that individual or they become remote, I think in that case, that's an individual decision of the manager, and they do allow, and a lot easier right now than potentially pre-COVID, because we realize. But for entry-level jobs, that are non-remote and become remote, I would say that would be hard.
Hi, I'm wondering how the competition across region would look like in the future, and if you have some early indication from the data. So suppose if farms in the high-paying region are trying to hire from low-cost region, then what would be the response of the employers in the low-cost region? So is there a tiered response or lag response you see in the data?
So what we have seen, both from the data and again by talking to a lot of individuals, that there is some type of a wage convergence in a way, and that actually has been slower than it should, in the sense that for the regions that were fairly cheaper, workers realized very fast that I don't have to work with the employer in this region. I can actually work with somebody that is in an area that pays a lot better. And vice versa, right? So for a lot of places, that were more expensive, they realized they can find talent that is either cheaper or equally costly, but potentially it's a lot easier for them. And so, like, we see this sort of, potentially wages going, upper for the cheaper and going down for the most expensive. So we're going to see some type of a, wage lock, within states, wage convergence potentially, and then even globally, with the very cheaper ones to grow up. Now, I do think that there is also some type of limitations, at least from a regional perspective, because what happened, especially when it comes to the discussion from a city perspective, is that what we did see parallel is that a lot of people actually moved to places that were cheaper and that they had great amenities. So in US specifically, we saw two regions actually people moved. A lot of them moved from San Francisco to Texas, to Austin, and a lot from New York moved to Florida, or from around the area because it was warm. There was no reason to move to Florida before, because besides the weather, which is great, but in terms of job opportunities, was very bad. Right? And suddenly now everybody's from the East Coast is moving to Florida, and a lot of people from the West Coast are moving to Texas. But there is some type of equilibrium effect there that is related, especially with housing prices and rents, because if everybody's moving out of Florida, then prices are jumping up. And so they can only reach a limit before people start living, right? And so I think there are these two equilibrium effects that are happening both in the wages and in the housing prices that will interact with each other in terms of maybe suddenly everybody goes to southern Italy, right? Because it's great there, and you can work with London and Germany and other places. But again, if southern Italy starts to become everybody goes there, that it will become very expensive. So.
I was wondering, you showed a very interesting slide that in Egypt is sort of the highest of accountancy. In the US, you had a high number of engineers, and I think in Pakistan it was graphic designers. And I was sort of wondering, is that a reflection of the existing skills in the sort of pre-remote working age? And also, to what extent is that becoming a self-enforcing or reinforcing phenomenon? I mean, we know about virtual assistants in the Philippines, for example. Going forwards, are they going to carry on as those trends, or are they becoming sort of global freelance occupations?
If I had to bet, I would bet that this will change significantly, because this is based on the current sort of also industry, infrastructure, and distribution that all of this region has. So it's sort of like a pre-remote, and pre-remote plus some outsourcing, related. So if I had to guess, a lot of this will change. I think one of the things that I did not discuss is that, especially if you were also to think and combine remote work with, with all of this ChatGPT, OpenAI type of stuff, it also then, you can see that, for example, some of these jobs become even more easier to do. Like, why would you have, some level, some basic marketing, right, in US? In theory, English now is not a barrier, so everybody can write essentially great, and then you have, Midjourney creating amazing graphics. You could, in theory, get a small, marketing firm almost everywhere in the world. So there's some level of, some of these jobs are actually becoming a lot easier both to do and also potentially, to do remotely. Some of these jobs are also being, especially the low paying, are disappearing. Especially the sort of the customer service jobs that we had that sort for all these years. I don't expect to see a lot of them in the next 5 to 10 years, especially I think that they're going to be replaced by generative AI. So to your question, I do think this will change significantly, and I do think that some of this will actually increase and some of this will disappear.
So given that what we've seen about both the supply and the demand for remote work, what is the main argument on the firm side that makes economic sense apart from the real estate that you you're still paying for offices and you want people to fill them, and there's an issue there. I mean, is there anything else underpinning the sort of the things we often read in the press that people might want everyone back because things change, or is there any evidence in the data that the data you collect that there is a pushback, a specific reason for this pushback? Because we see the economic reasons for using remote work, and not just within a country but across different places. But is it sort of the regulatory, is it the tax, or is it something else that possibly we're missing here?
So there are a lot of things that potentially we're missing here. I think most of this work is descriptive in showing what has happened, what potentially may even can happen. It's not discussing if what has happened or not happened actually is good from a firm level or even an individual level, right? It's speculating on some of the benefits, but there's a lot of I think there's a lot of questions that are open that will need future research. So for example, does remote work, there's a lot of discussion that remote work is not as productive as non-remote work. We don't know. We don't have any real evidence right yet, and I think it's too early. Is it, for the individual, is it the same easy to be promoted if they're working in a remote job versus a non-remote job? It's something that we don't know. So the benefit from a company level and the benefit or cost from a company level, or benefit cost besides just the basic cost, these are still open sort of research questions that we don't have a great answer. We can have some speculations, but we don't really know. Like, is the mobility of workers the same? Is it able, for example, for a company to access a more diverse pool of individuals if they do remotely or not? We can speculate, yes, but there's no real data that we have seen today. So the discussion today is basically focused on cost efficiencies, but there's other type of cost and benefits to the company and then to individual, which I think there are open research questions. They're a tough one. We need to wait a little bit. We need some lag for this to happen and see what is really going on.
So for the final question, Lily Online has asked, do you have any insights on the demographics of remote workers, i.e. are there more men or women working remotely?
I do not. It would not be very difficult to get, but I don't have a clear answer to that specifically now based on the data that I do have. The thing that we do know, at least from some data, is that remote work has increased sort of a participation of people that were not able to work as easily before, right? And so like either people that had disability, like we've seen that there's been an increase in participation of people that could not go to a physical space, that now they can work remotely. Or, for example, a specific segment of population that was very difficult for them, like we had like women's veterans that had to move all the time and they were not able, for example, to find a very specific job. So there are a specific segment of the population that was very hard for them to be able to find a permanent job in an office, and we've seen that there's been an increase in their participation in the labor force.
Thank you very much, Bledi. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Please keep an eye on the Oxford Martin School events, and thank you everyone online. Thanks.
Thank you.